Most of us learned the wrong rule about intuition. If it came fast and felt right, it had to be true. There's a real Book of Thoth, not a legend, not a summary of a summary, an actual Egyptian text, discovered, translated, and published by academics. Buried inside it is a single rule almost nobody follows anymore: never answer on the first response. And there's a name that keeps crossing centuries, one the Western tradition keeps trying to trap inside a closed myth. Without noticing, it never actually stopped repeating itself: Sophia. If you think trusting the first certainty that rises in you is a sign of sharp intuition, wait until you hear the difference between the voice that knows and the voice that only reacts, because that difference is exactly what defined the worst decision I made in the last 2 years, without me noticing it happening. Why does a disciple 2,000 years ago never close the conversation on the first answer that sounds good? And why does that same pause show up today, measured inside the brain of someone who meditates? To understand that, I need to tell you what happened on a Monday night a few weeks ago. Before we go on, do one thing with me. Breathe in all the way once. Hold it for a second. Let it out slowly. Keep that breath somewhere. It comes back later, and it will mean more than it seems right now. A few weeks ago, on a Monday night, I ended a 2-year partnership with a single text message. It took me 4 minutes to write. I read it once, I sent it. In that moment, I felt an absurd clarity, the kind that seems to come from somewhere deeper than anger. 3 weeks later, I understood it hadn't been clarity at all. It was haste, wearing clarity's clothes, dressed so well that I didn't notice the difference while I was writing it. Not the next day, not the day after that. And the strangest part, I had just reread, days before, the exact text that should have warned me about this. What I didn't notice that night was my own field. My mind said clarity, but my body was compressed, short breath, a locked shoulder, a strange urgency with no real danger underneath it, holding it up. I've been noticing this kind of thing for years. It's practically a second profession of mine, reading what moves through a room and through a body before any of it turns into a thought, let alone a word. I've walked into places where an urgency I felt for no reason disappeared the moment I left. The urgency didn't seem entirely born in me. Something in that space was amplifying it. And even so, I didn't stop to check my own field before closing the book on that message. When information is clean, it can be firm, but it doesn't need to push you. That one pushed me. The book I'm talking about is called, in the academic edition, by Richard Jasnow and Carl Theodor Zauzich, published in 2005, The Ancient Egyptian Book of Thoth. A demotic Egyptian text, the late cursive script used in the last centuries before the Common Era, deciphered and published by Egyptologists, not by some curiosity website. The shape of the text is simple, and it's exactly that shape I want you to hold on to. A disciple asks questions, calling the divine figure master, guide, asking to be led to the place of knowledge. A figure called He Who Loves Knowledge answers, and behind that answer, Egyptian tradition has always recognized the voice of Thoth, god of writing and of the right measure of things. What interests me here isn't decoding the text's mystery line by line, it's noticing the structure of the conversation. The answer never comes whole all at once. He asks, he listens, he processes, and only afterward comes back to ask again, sometimes pages later. This repeats dozens of times. Nobody in this 2,000-year-old manuscript closes the conversation on the first answer that sounds good. That structure gave me a ladder I use for the whole video to examine my own decisions, perception, sensation, interpretation, reaction, decision, action, and finally, total identification with certainty, the point where you no longer observe the process, you just obey it. That list isn't on the Egyptian papyrus. It's not an archaeological find. It's my own hermetic reading, built from the pattern between this text, the visions I'm about to tell you, and the experience I lived through myself. I'll call the 7 stages gates, and I'll name each one as it comes up. The academic translators themselves debate whether he who loves knowledge is really Thoth speaking directly or a human master scribe speaking in his name. I won't pretend that debate is settled. Citing it as open is more honest than citing it as consensus. It's worth saying what this book isn't, too. Most videos about the Book of Thoth cite a list of 42 sacred books attributed to Clement of Alexandria, books nobody has ever found because they never reached us as a verifiable physical collection. This one is different. It exists, it's cataloged, it has an academic edition. I'd rather cite a source you can check than a legend that just sounds better. I found that curious the first time I read it. I found it even more curious the second time, the reread, days before I sent that message, because what I actually did was the exact opposite of it. Now, the other name in the title, Sophia, and this is where most people get it wrong from the start, myself included, until I actually looked into it seriously. The most repeated image of Sophia is a fallen figure, an old myth of Gnostic origin, about a wisdom that gets lost and needs to be rescued, a character from a distant story sealed inside a mythology book with no connection at all to your Monday night. That's the surface everyone repeats, without ever checking if it's the only reading available. It isn't the only one. Rudolf Steiner, founder of Anthroposophy, wrote and lectured in the early 20th century, treating Sophia, divine wisdom, not as a fallen character from a closed myth, but as a living presence. The material from those lectures was later gathered into a volume called Isis Mary Sophia. In it, the lineage is clear, from Egyptian Isis to Mary to Sophia, 3 names for the same thing, updating itself through history, not a figure who fell once and needed to be rescued back. Something that keeps happening now, not something that happened once, centuries ago, and ended there. That's the whole divergence of this video, summed up in one sentence. Most people treat wisdom as something you find ready-made once and keep forever, like a diploma. I've come to treat it as something built decision by decision with no guarantee that the last wise choice protects the next one, and my Monday night proves exactly how big that difference is. You've made a fast decision before, certain, undeniable in the moment, that later turned out to be nothing but haste, dressed up as clarity. Vladimir Solovyov, and a few decades later, on the other side of Europe, Rudolf Steiner described the same thing with different names. Sophia, divine wisdom, doesn't arrive as intensity. It arrives as presence, and presence demands a pause that force can't buy. If you've prayed, affirmed, and decided for years of practice and still feel like you're spinning in the same mistake, this is why. You keep confusing the strength of what you feel with actual wisdom. Stay to the end of this video. What I'm about to show you is waiting in the link in the description. And here comes the part I hadn't told anyone in public yet. I didn't just sit and read Steiner. After my Monday, I needed to know if what he described, presence that demands time, not intensity, had any echo outside of Anthroposophy. Because if it were just one isolated system of thought, I could be swapping one fast belief for another without actually gaining anything true. I went looking to see if anyone, somewhere else in the world, had described that same presence, without ever having read Steiner, without any contact with Anthroposophy at all. And there was. You might be thinking that 2 spiritual thinkers arriving at a similar idea isn't a big deal. That happens all the time, in any tradition, and on its own, it proves nothing. I agree with that doubt. Actually, I recommend it. But wait until you see the distance between these two before you decide it's coincidence. On the other side of Europe, at almost the same time, a Russian philosopher named Vladimir Solovyov wrote an autobiographical poem called 3 Encounters, Trisvidania in the original. In it, he recounts 3 personal visions of Sophia across his whole life. As a child, in a church in Moscow, years later, as an adult, in a library in London, and finally, in the desert near Cairo, on a trip he himself describes with a date attached. Notice the interval. These weren't 3 visions in one afternoon. They were 3 spread across decades, a philosopher recounting, with place and time marked, moments when he felt the living presence of what he called the soul of the world. That trip to the Egyptian desert, in particular, he made on purpose, chasing the third vision. He didn't passively wait for it to come to him at home. He went looking, knowing he needed to put himself in position, and still waited however long the presence demanded before anything happened. Solovyov doesn't technically describe what he felt in each place, so I can't claim what happened. I can only investigate, as a clairvoyant would, what draws my attention. In the church in Moscow, still a boy, was there unusual silence, a shift in light, a sense of presence? He doesn't detail it, but the first vision shows up in exactly the place most saturated with ritual silence in the whole account. In the library in London, a whole space dedicated to accumulated knowledge can carry its own kind of pensenic saturation. And in the Egyptian desert, the last time, an almost total reduction of physical stimulus, amplifying whatever is left to perceive. 3 environments, 3 different shapes of silence. I'm not claiming that's what it was, but the repetition catches my attention. In the sources I checked, I found no evidence that Steiner built his reading of Sophia from Solovyov, which doesn't prove there was no contact, only the limits of my own research. Solovyov died in 1900 when Steiner was still working out the first steps of his own body of work. 2 traditions, 2 languages, 2 different intellectual lineages formulated in separate contexts and both describing the same thing, each in its own vocabulary. Sophia isn't a character from a closed myth. She's a presence that shows up again for whoever knows how to wait the time she asks for. It's worth noting that Solovyov didn't stay isolated after he died. Sergei Bulgakov picked up that same lineage decades later and built on top of it what's now called sofiology, a field of Russian theology that has stayed alive, debated, revised for more than a century. That doesn't prove anything on its own. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not stacking sources to sound more certain. When different traditions arrive at similar images, I don't treat that as proof, but I consider it a pattern worth investigating. And here's where the contradiction shows up, because the culture most of us absorbed, without even noticing where it came from, teaches a silent rule. If you felt it strongly, it was true. If the certainty came fast, without hesitation, it was because it was right. Manifestation culture, self-help, even part of modern spiritual language, repeat that rule disguised as intuition. You've probably seen this in some manifestation video. You'll feel it in your body right away, and that proves it's true. Except the real opposition was never speed against wisdom. A genuine perception can be instant. Clairvoyance is rarely slow. A wrong rationalization can drag on for weeks, dressed up as deep reflection. What separates the two was never the speed. It was whether you observed the state the certainty came from, or just obeyed it. Observed speed is different from blindly obeyed speed. Solovyov waited decades between one vision and the next, not because all speed is suspect, but because he knew how to recognize when presence hadn't arrived yet, instead of forcing an answer in its place. I didn't make that distinction on the night of that message. I didn't get it wrong because I decided fast. I got it wrong because I never stopped to observe where the certainty was coming from. I just obeyed it. But this doesn't have to stay only in the realm of belief or philosophical reading. There's a neuroscientist named Andrew Newberg who spent years studying the brains of people in contemplative practice. In his book, How God Changes Your Brain, from 2009, he shows something worth taking seriously. Contemplative practices, sustained pause, conscious breathing are associated with changes in circuits linked to attention, emotional regulation, and impulse control. That doesn't prove Steiner's Sophia or Solovyov's soul of the world, but it shows the pause isn't just a pretty spiritual metaphor. It also seems to change, measurably, how we react. When I first read that data, I stopped reading for a full minute. not because it proves anything about divine presence, but because it means the habit of observing before obeying a certainty has a real, documented effect. Call it presence, call it emotional regulation. The practical effect seems to be the same. Now think of a recent decision of yours that came fast and felt too obvious to question. Did you observe the state that certainty came from, or did you just obey it? Most of us can't answer that in the moment we're deciding. That's exactly why most of us repeat the same mistake year after year. Notice something almost nobody puts together. We measure whether a decision was wise the same way we measure whether a product is good, by the immediate reaction. If it came fast and felt right in the moment, we call it sharp intuition. But Steiner and Solovyov never described presence that way in anything that survives of their writing. Both describe something that arrives afterward, never at the peak of emotion, always once the noise settles. There's a second belief that gets in the way even more, that pausing is weakness, that whoever hesitates loses the moment. You've probably heard that one, overthink it and you lose it. Newberg showed the opposite. Brains of people who practice regular contemplative pause show more activity in the prefrontal cortex, not less capacity to decide. The pause doesn't delay the right decision. It's the only thing that separates a right decision from a well-disguised impulse. And here I need to correct something I said imprecisely a few minutes ago. The voice that knows and the voice that reacts are names too broad for four different phenomena. Emotional reaction is intense, urgent, defensive. It wants to resolve things right now. Intuition is a fast synthesis of a repertoire you already have. I call paraperception the hypothesis that a piece of information was perceived beyond the ordinary physical senses, but the feeling alone doesn't prove where it came from. It needs to be checked against context, repetition, and confirmation, never accepted at face value. And then there's external influence, an idea reinforced by someone else, or by an emotional and energetic pattern already installed in a place before you even walked into it. The question was never just, is this wisdom or haste? It's which of these four things am I actually feeling right now, and what do I actually have to confirm it? Two beliefs, both wrong at the root, and both were exactly what convinced me that Monday night that I didn't need to wait even one more minute to send that message. Not every fast decision is bad. A car coming straight at you doesn't ask for 10 seconds of breathing because there's real, concrete danger right there. Mine, about the partnership, had none. Nothing was going to change in 10 seconds. I just felt like it would, and that feeling of urgency, alone, with nothing real holding it up, was what I mistook for wisdom. There's a concept used for decades inside conscienciology, the research field founded by Waldo Vieira, that treats conscious energy as an object of investigation, not belief, called the pensée. Thought, feeling, and energy never arrive separately. Every decision carries all three together, even when you only notice the thought. An idea can seem brilliant and still come wrapped in an energy of fear or a wish to win an argument. Treating that energy as proof of being right was exactly the mistake I made. The certainty I felt was the whole package, carried by one of the four things I named a moment ago, and I never separated one from the other before deciding. A piece was missing from all of this, and I only built it after I got it wrong. Not before, after. Inspired by a reading of Caitlin Matthews on Sophia, not her technique, let me be clear about that, just the inspiration to build my own, I developed a small practice I call the 3 breaths pause. It's mine, I created it. It's not a translation of any ancient text, and I'll say that every time I mention it. Here's how it works. First, the instant a decision feels too obvious, too fast to need even one more second, I stop physically. I literally stop my body, put down whatever I'm holding. Second, 3 full breaths, complete, unhurried, every single one of them. Third, in silence, I examine the whole pensée, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and what energy is riding along with that certainty. And only then do I ask if that's the voice that knows or the voice that's just reacting. Fourth, I sit with that question for 10 full seconds before acting without trying to answer fast. 10 seconds. It's not an hour of meditation. It doesn't require a retreat. It doesn't require anything beyond stopping the body. It's the minimum space for presence to have any chance of arriving before haste closes the book on its own without consulting anyone else. I used this practice for the first time 3 days after I sent that message on a much smaller decision whether or not to answer a work email that same night. It sounds like nothing, but that's exactly where I noticed the difference between the voice that reacts and the voice that knows. The first wants an answer now and gets irritated by the delay. The second isn't in any hurry to prove anything. Only after repeating it a few times on small decisions did I trust it enough to bring it to the decisions that actually hurt. Remember the breath I asked you for at the start of this video? That was the first of the 3. You already started the practice without knowing you'd started it. Now I go back to the decision I told you about at the start. In the weeks before that Monday, I'd been trusting every certainty that rose fast: work, money, that partnership, calling it, to myself, sharp intuition. It felt like progress. It felt, finally, like someone who trusts his own voice. It wasn't the speed that betrayed me. It was that I never stopped to observe where the certainty was coming from before obeying it. Perception, sensation, interpretation, reaction, decision, action. I crossed all 7 gates in 4 minutes without noticing any of the first 6, straight to the 7th, total identification with certainty, the point where you no longer observe anything, you just obey. The exact opposite of what the disciple in the Thoth text does on every page, because the shape of the book itself doesn't let him close it early. And the message I sent that Monday, the one that hurt, wasn't an isolated stumble from one bad night. It was the same 7th gate as always, reached again, except this time the price came fast enough for me to actually see it. It wasn't the message that changed after I understood this. It had already been sent, the damage was already done, and there's no breath that undoes a message already read on the other end. I was the one who changed how I read it. I stopped treating the speed as the problem and started treating the absence of observation as the real problem. The compressed body, the short breath, the urgency with no real danger, the signal was all there in the first 6 gates. I just never stopped at any of them. You won't remember this as my story about a guy who lost a partnership. You'll remember it the next time you feel a certainty rising too fast inside you, and you'll ask yourself, maybe for the first time in your life, which gate you're at before you land straight on the 7th. That question from now on is yours. I can't ask it for you anymore. I already told you mine. The message, the haste, the price of 2 years of work. If you have one, and almost everyone does, comment "Am I Rush" with yours. I read every comment. It doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be true. So what we've seen today is that the real obstacle was never a lack of hermetic knowledge or willpower. It's confusing the strength of a feeling with the presence of real wisdom, closing the book on a decision the moment it feels right instead of pausing long enough to actually know. I call this pattern threshold amnesia, a term of mine, for something I started noticing simply because it kept repeating. I spent months turning it into something you actually walk through, not just understand. The result is 7 gate. Inside it, the Codex of the 7 gates guides you through 3 stages. First, you finally diagnose which gate you closed too early and why. Second, you walk through the named threshold protocol, a structured sequence day by day through the 7 gates, in order, no shortcuts. Third, you cross what waits beyond the 7th gate, the shift from someone who feels certainty to someone who actually knows. Every gate you complete gets sealed inside the app, a visible record of the work. The link is in the description below. Your first gate is already open. And here it's maybe worth returning to the title of this video. There's no historical list in any manuscript called the 7 Gates of Sophia. That architecture is the Hermetic reading I build across this whole video, not a documented discovery. Inside it, the 7th gate isn't a passage located in some invisible temple or a place you cross physically. It's the exact point where consciousness stops observing its own experience and starts obeying it. The first 6, perception, sensation, interpretation, reaction, decision, action, are still observing. The 7th no longer observes anything, and that's why it should never be reached at the peak of fascination, anger, or haste, only after the whole Pensine has been examined. So, what's left in the end isn't a ready-made lesson for you to shelve next to my story. It's a question that now lives with you, the same way it started living with me since that Monday night. The next time a decision feels too good to question, too fast to deserve even one more second, you'll remember that breath, the first one I asked for at the start, without explaining why yet. You'll stop your body, take the other 2, and ask in silence, is this the voice that knows or the voice that's just reacting? 10 seconds, that's all. I don't promise the answer will feel obvious in those 10 seconds. Sometimes it doesn't. But the question already changes something even without a clear answer. Whoever asks doesn't close the book the instant the certainty starts to rise. In my own reading of Steiner and Solovyov, and it is my own reading, not a literal quote from either of them, Sophia doesn't ask for intensity. She asks for availability. In the accounts I use here, understanding comes after the waiting, not at the peak of urgency. You can wait 10 seconds too before the next time. I didn't write this video to give you a ready answer. I wrote it to give you back the time I didn't give myself that night, the 10 seconds that might have changed the message, or maybe changed nothing at all, but that I at least would have chosen with the right voice. One thing still bothers me, and I'll leave it open because I don't have a closed answer for it. Solovyov saw Sophia 3 times in his life, not once, 3 times, spaced across whole decades. If his presence was already genuine the first time in that church in Moscow, why did he need 2 more, years later, on the other side of the world? What was he still learning to hear between the first encounter and the last? Is the 10-second pause that works for a Monday night message the same pause that has to hold for 20, 30 years between one revelation and the next? Or are there different scales of waiting, and I've only learned the smallest one so far? I don't know how to answer that. But since I read his story to the end, I stopped thinking my own 10-second pause is the end of the practice, the final point of the question. Maybe it's only the first of several encounters still coming, and maybe I'll only recognize the second one when it arrives, the same way Solovyov took years to recognize his, with no hurry at all to rush what hadn't come yet.